The shift log for the 1,200-foot level of the Anaconda mine, Butte, Montana, runs for 43 consecutive pages without a gap in the record. Every working day from the 14th of April, 1893 to the 22nd of October, 1895, drill advance, powder charge, mucking tonnage, water seepage, timber set. The handwriting across most of those pages belongs to a shift boss named Patrick Reardon, an immigrant from County Clare who had been working copper ground in the Montana Territory since 1881 and who had, over 14 years underground, developed a reputation among his crew as a man who logged what he saw without addition or omission. On the 23rd of October 1895, the shift log for that level ends. The next entry in the bound volume is dated the 7th of November 1895, in a different hand entirely, and it begins not with a record of work accomplished, but with a dry inventory of timber stores and hardware costs that reads as if the weeks before it had never existed. 16 days are missing. The void in that record is not accidental. It is not the result of a damaged volume or a misplaced page. The binding of the log shows no evidence of removal. The pages were never there. The shift log is held now in the Montana Historical Society archive in Helena, catalogued and accessible, and the gap is exactly as it appears, a deliberate absence in a record that had otherwise held every working day without exception. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Patrick Reardon did not come to Butte looking for copper. He came because the wages were higher than anything available in the stone quarries of County Clare, and because his brother Declan had preceded him by 3 years and written home that the ground beneath Butte Hill was the richest he had ever seen a man drill through. By 1895, Reardon had been underground longer than he had been above it. He knew the 1,200-foot level the way a man knows his own house, the exact location where the hanging wall sweated worst in summer, the drift where the timber sets always ran short, the 2 spots where a man could feel the air move even when the ventilation pumps were idle. He had supervised a crew of 11 men through 18 months of advance along the western drift, without a serious injury, which in a Butte copper mine in the 1890s was a record worth noting. His name appears on 23 separate payroll documents in the Anaconda Company's employment records held at the Montana Historical Society. His signature is on shift cards, timber requisitions, and a single disciplinary report from September of 1894 concerning a powder misfeed that he blamed on supplier error and successfully argued to management. He was not a man given to invention. The men who worked under him said as much in the years after, and what they meant by it was specific. A shift boss who inflated his tonnage numbers or exaggerated his ground conditions to management was common enough in Butte that the ones who did not stood out. Reardon's log entries for the western drift, taken across 18 months, show no pattern of over-reporting. They show a man who recorded 4 feet of advance on a 4-foot day and said nothing when the face came in slow. What those 18 months of consistent, unembellished logging also show is a man thoroughly familiar with what the ground under Butte Hill looked like when it behaved normally and when it did not. He had drilled through gas pockets, through flooded stopes, through zones of anomalous heat that came and went without explanation in the deeper workings. He had seen rock that crumbled and rock that rang like iron when the drill met it. The October 21st entry, where he notes the change in air movement and the altered sound of the percussion, reads like what it is. A man who recognized that the ground ahead was behaving in a way he had not encountered before, and who responded by stopping and writing it down exactly as he found it. What his crew was drilling toward in October of 1895 was a contact zone. In copper geology, a contact is the boundary between 2 different rock types, and in the Butte Hill Formation, contacts often carried sulfide concentrations dense enough to transform a marginal working into a profitable one within a single shift's advance. Marcus Daly, who had built the Anaconda out of a silver prospect that turned copper in 1881, was under pressure from the capital interests behind him to sustain extraction tonnage against a falling copper price. The western drift at 1,200 feet was one of 3 priority advances he had authorized that autumn. The drilling crew was working 10-hour shifts on a compressed schedule, and Reardon's log for the week of the 14th through the 20th of October shows the crew advancing at just over 4 feet per day, which was fast for hard rock and hard on the drill steel. The entry for the 21st of October records routine morning measurements and a note that the face of the drift had changed character. Reardon wrote, in the clipped shorthand of a working log, that the rock ahead had gone softer and that the drill was pulling without the usual resistance. He noted a change in the sound of the percussion. He noted an increase in air movement from the face, unusual in a dead-end drift with a solid wall ahead. His entry ends with a single line, advise holding powder until morning inspection. On the 22nd, the log records the morning inspection. It records that Reardon descended with 2 men, a driller named Francis Sheehan, and a mucker listed only as Kowalski in the payroll records. The entry describes a breach in the drift face of approximately 18 inches in diameter, a void beyond the breach of undetermined extent, and what Reardon described as a movement of warm air from the opening inconsistent with natural draft from the shaft. The final line of that entry reads, "Sent for the super, held the crew at the station." That is the last line Patrick Reardon wrote in the 1,200-foot level log. By Thursday the 24th, the drift was sealed. The period between the Wednesday morning entry and the Thursday completion of the seal is 36 hours. In that window, a shift boss sent for his superintendent, a district manager traveled to the mine from Butte, a decision was made at a level of authority well above the working, a materials order was dispatched to the smelter shop 16 miles away, welders were transported to the mine, rolled steel plate was delivered and fabricated to fit a drift opening, and the completed seal was logged in the supply requisition before 5 in the morning. The concentration of institutional force in 36 hours for a working that had been advancing steadily without incident for 18 months is the first measure of what the 22nd of October produced. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company in 1895 was not simply a mine, it was the largest copper producer in the Western Hemisphere and the economic engine of the Montana Territory, which had become a state only 6 years prior. Daly's operation employed more than 3,000 men in and around Butte, controlled the smelter at Anaconda City, 16 miles to the west, owned the railroad connecting the two, and maintained financial relationships that would eventually connect to the Standard Oil acquisition of the company in 1899. The men who ran the Anaconda in the autumn of 1895 were practiced at making decisions quickly and recording them selectively. The copper market in that period rewarded companies that could move extraction capital to productive ground without the delays that formal disclosure would impose, and the culture of the Anaconda's field management reflected that. A working capped, a crew reassigned, a level closed. These were daily operational decisions that moved through the management chain without generating the kind of documentation that might later require explanation. The machinery for covering a significant closure, if that was what the Western Drift required, was already in ordinary use for lesser purposes. The men who ran it had practiced the mechanics of institutional discretion long before October of 1895. What distinguishes the October event from the ordinary run of mine incidents sealed by corporate discretion is the speed of the response and the involvement of a man not connected to routine underground decisions. A district manager named Howard Plunkett, whose name appears in company correspondence at the Montana Historical Society, traveled from the Anaconda Company's Butte headquarters to the mine site on the afternoon of the 23rd of October. His presence at the shaft is recorded in a single line of the mine superintendent's daybook, Plunkett down at 2:1200 closed, end quote. The daybook does not record why Plunkett came, what he saw below, or what order he gave. It records only that he arrived and that the level was closed the same afternoon. A district manager making an unannounced visit to a working shift is not standard procedure in an operation of that scale. The management hierarchy of the Anaconda placed men like Plunkett well above the level of routine shaft decisions. that he travelled to the mine the same day Reardon sent for the superintendent, and that the level was closed the same afternoon Plunkett arrived, are facts the daybook places beside each other without comment. Arthur Voss, the superintendent who wrote those 3 lines, remained with the company through the amalgamated acquisition and retired in 1910. What he knew about the afternoon of the 23rd is not recorded in any document that has survived. The crew of the Western Drift was reassigned to the 1400-foot level within the week. Francis Sheehan, the driller who had gone forward with Reardon on the 22nd, transferred out of the Anaconda mine entirely and drew his final company pay on the 2nd of November. He appears in Butte city directories through 1902, working as a surface labourer for the Parrot mine, with no recorded return to underground work. A man who had drilled rock for 11 years did not go underground again. The mucker listed as Kowalski does not appear in any subsequent Anaconda payroll document. He does not appear in Butte city directories for the relevant years. His first name is not recorded in the surviving employment files. The physical sealing of the Western Drift was accomplished with a speed that mine engineers of the period would have considered extreme. Standard practice for closing a worked-out or unsafe drift called for a timber bulkhead, sometimes backed with loose rock fill, built over a period of days. The 1,200-foot Western Drift received a welded steel plate closure. The materials requisition for that work, a document that survived in the company's supply ledger at the Montana Historical Society, records the delivery of rolled steel plate and the engagement of 2 contract welders from the Anaconda Smelter's fabrication shop on the 24th of October. The welders worked through the night. The requisition marks the job complete at 4:30 in the morning on the 25th. Steel plate welded closures were not standard practice in copper mine drifts in 1895. Timber bulkheads were standard. Steel doors with bolt locks were used in drifts where gas accumulation was a documented concern. A welded plate with no hinge and no inspection port was a permanent seal, the underground equivalent of bricking over a doorway and plastering the surface smooth. It said that whoever ordered it did not anticipate any future access and did not want the closure to resemble a door. The morning shift on the 25th, the men not on the Western Drift crew and without direct knowledge of what Reardon had found on the 22nd, would have come off the cage at the 1200 level and found a plate where a working drift had been. They were not in a position to ask why, and the record shows no evidence that anyone did. How institutional silence is built in an operation the size of the Anaconda is worth setting out plainly, because the mechanism matters to what happened in the days after the sealing. The men who received reassignment orders did not know what Reardon had found. The welders dispatched from the smelter shop knew only that they had been sent for on short notice and paid for a night shift. Plunkett returned to an office where no written account of his afternoon at the shaft was required, and none was generated. Each of those men held one piece of what had happened. None held enough to form a question that could not be deflected. This is the architecture of a controlled silence, not a single secret held by many people, but many partial facts held by people who have no structural reason to compare notes, managed at a distance by the one man who saw the whole. Plunkett's role was not to swear anyone to silence. It was to ensure that the sequence of events never assembled itself in one place where it could be read as a sequence. What Reardon told his wife in the weeks after the sealing is not preserved in any official document. What survives is a letter held in a private collection, written in the spring of 1912 by a woman named Margaret Reardon to her brother in County Clare. The letter covers several subjects: the health of her youngest child, the price of coal that winter, and the fact that her husband Patrick had been dead for 11 years, having died of lung disease in 1901 at 47 years of age. Near the end of the letter, Margaret writes that she had been going through Patrick's papers and had found a small notebook she had not seen before. She describes it as a pocket journal of the kind shift bosses carried for rough notes before transcribing to the formal log. She writes that she read it and did not understand most of what it contained, but that the contents did not seem meant to be thrown away. She says she gave the notebook to the parish priest, a Father Michael Callahan of St. Patrick's Church in Butte, asking him to keep it safely. Father Callahan died in 1917. The records of St. Patrick's Parish for that period, including any itemized list of effects left in the priest's care, do not survive. A fire in the parish rectory in 1923 destroyed a significant portion of the archival materials held there. The nature of that fire, its origin and extent, is recorded only in a brief notice in the Butte Daily Post for the 9th of March of that year, which describes a fire of undetermined cause that consumed the rectory's upper floor and the storage rooms adjacent to it. The pocket notebook has not been located in any subsequent collection or catalogue. What survives is Margaret Reardon's description of it in a single paragraph of a private letter written 17 years after the event to a brother in Ireland who had no frame of reference for what she was describing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That paragraph carries details specific enough to argue against casual invention. Margaret does not describe anything fantastical, and she does not describe a vision or a haunting. She writes, based on a transcription made by the private collector who holds the letter, that Patrick had written about a space beyond the breach in the drift face that was not a natural cave. She writes that he described walls that were not natural rock. She writes that he described what he called working marks on the stone, by which she understood him to mean cuts or shaped surfaces that a man's tool had made. And she writes that he said the air coming from the void smelled of what he could only describe as old fire, meaning not active combustion but the residue of fire from a long time before, the way a stone fireplace smells in a house that has been empty for years. The phrase old fire deserves particular attention. A working miner in the Butte underground of the 1890s was surrounded by the smell of black powder, of sulfide ore, of wet timber, of lamp oil, of rock dust, and of the particular chemical signature that different mineral zones produce as the drill cuts through them. Reardon had 14 years of working knowledge of what underground air smelled like in its ordinary range, his specific choice of old fire, and his specific effort to distinguish it from current combustion by modifying it with the word old, is not the language of a man reaching for a vivid description. It is the language of a man trying to be accurate about something for which accurate vocabulary did not readily exist, reaching for the closest analogy available to him and then immediately qualifying it to prevent misreading. Margaret Reardon was not a credulous woman. The letter she wrote in 1912 is careful, a little wary of its own contents. She prefaces the passage about the notebook by writing that she is not a person who believes in stories, and she ends by saying she does not know what to think and supposes it does not much matter now. The letter is not the record of someone making a dramatic claim. It is the account of someone who found something unexpected and set it down honestly because she had been raised to be careful with information she did not fully understand. The geological context matters here in the same way it matters to any sealed record whose physical contents have been removed from institutional access. The copper-bearing veins at Butte run through a granodiorite batholith, an intrusive igneous mass that rose through the Earth's crust during the late Cretaceous period. Intruded into that same batholith are zones of older metamorphic rock, contact aureoles, where the heat of the igneous intrusion altered existing formations and in certain cases produced unusual secondary structures. Those contact zones are irregular, occasionally generating natural voids and in specific circumstances producing what geologists call ghost structures, preserved outlines of formations that no longer exist in their original material because they have been replaced over millions of years by different minerals. Ghost structures in contact aureole zones can produce surfaces that read, to an untrained eye, as intentional. They can produce features that look like worked stone, like shaped walls, like joining edges where one surface meets another at a deliberate angle. This is the explanation the institutional record would reach for, if it engaged with the Reardon account at all. The features he described were a natural artifact of the contact metamorphic zone. The sealing of the drift was a precautionary response to the soft ground ahead, and the speed of the closure was a function of engineering necessity. Each of those explanations is possible in isolation. What makes them difficult to accept together is the welded plate, and something else, the fact that Patrick Reardon had been identifying geological features underground for 14 years and chose not to describe what he found in geological terms. He used the word cave to say what the space was not. He used the phrase working marks to describe the surfaces, a term a shift boss would apply to features bearing the marks of human tools rather than the marks of water, heat, or mineral replacement. Ghost structures in contact metamorphic geology do not require welded steel to contain. Soft ground does not require a closure that cannot be reopened without cutting equipment. A precautionary safety seal in a copper mine in 1895 did not require the engagement of a fabrication shop at the company's flagship smelter, a night shift of contract welders dispatched from 16 miles away, and a job marked complete at 4:30 in the morning. What the response argues for is how seriously the men who ordered the closure regarded what Reardon had seen at the face of the Western Drift. The evidence of the response is in certain respects more legible than the evidence of the finding itself. There is also the matter of old fire, which no geological account of contact metamorphic features addresses. Fire requires oxygen. A sealed underground void at 1,200 feet below the surface of Butte Hill would exhaust available oxygen long before any natural sealing event could preserve combustion residue in a form detectable to a man standing at an 18-inch breach. For a space to smell of old fire, air would have to have circulated there within a time frame recent enough to leave an olfactory trace that a working miner could identify and name. Reardon had spent 14 years underground. He knew what rock smelled like, and what gas smelled like, and what standing water in a flooded sump smelled like. He used the word fire. He modified it with the word old to distinguish it from the smell of an active ignition source. He was describing a memory the stone had kept, and he was precise enough about it to record the distinction in a pocket journal he never intended the company to see. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company underwent its transformation in 1899, when Henry Rogers and William Rockefeller, operating through the Standard Oil financial network, acquired a controlling interest and absorbed the operation into the Amalgamated Copper Company. Marcus Daly, who had built the mine from a silver prospect and who had been the man ultimately responsible for whatever decisions were made in the autumn of 1895, died the following year at 62 years of age. The men who came in with Amalgamated were not interested in the mine's prior history. They were interested in its output, its labor costs, and its capital structure. The underground records from the Daly period, the shift logs, the daybooks, the survey maps, and the payroll files were transferred as a condition of the acquisition to the Anaconda Company's formal archive. A portion of those records subsequently passed to the Montana Historical Society when the Anaconda Company ceased operations in 1980. What survives is not a complete record. Archivists at the Historical Society have noted documented gaps in the survey correspondence from the period 1894 through 1896. The 1200 level survey maps from October of 1895 are not among the surviving materials. Howard Plunkett left the Anaconda Company's employ in the spring of 1896. He moved to San Francisco, where he worked for a mining investment house for the following decade. He died in the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, a fact recorded in the California death registers. His personal papers, if they existed, did not survive the fire. Arthur Voss, the superintendent whose daybook recorded Plunkett's visit to the 1200 level, remained with the Anaconda through the amalgamated acquisition and retired in 1910. His daybook for the period October through December of 1895 is held at the Montana Historical Society, accessible, and the relevant entry is there for any researcher who knows what to look for. 3 lines on a Tuesday afternoon, and then the record moves on. What is not there is any subsequent reference in any surviving Anaconda Company document to the Western Drift, to the welded closure, to Patrick Reardon's findings, to Francis Sheehan, or to the man listed as Kowalski. A sealed drift would ordinarily appear on subsequent survey maps as a closed working, marked with the date of closure and the reason. The 1200 Western Drift does not appear on any surviving Anaconda survey map. It is not marked as closed. It is not marked at all. The survey maps begin their coverage of the 1200 level at a point well east of where the Western Drift would have terminated. The drift has been removed, not from the work record alone, but from the cartographic record of what existed underground, which is a different order of erasure. A line removed from a map is not the same as a line that was never drawn. The first is an act, the second is an absence. Only one of them requires a decision. A mining company maintaining its underground survey records has no operational reason to remove a closed drift from its cartographic record. The standard practice was to mark it closed, date the closure, and retain it as a reference for future survey work and for the safety planning of adjacent workings. A drift that disappears entirely from the survey maps does not give any information to the engineers who come after it about what the ground in that area is known to contain. It prevents them from treating the ground as known. It treats it instead as if no one had ever drilled there, which is, from an engineering standpoint, a false and potentially dangerous representation of what the underground contains. The removal of the Western Drift from the 1200 level survey maps was not a careless omission. It was a decision that accepted engineering risk in exchange for the assurance that no future survey crew would have reason to ask what the drift had reached. The Anaconda mine operated in various forms through the following decades until the open-pit Berkeley pit conversion began consuming the underground workings from above in the 1960s. The Berkeley pit, which the Anaconda Company's successors expanded over the following 2 decades, absorbed or flooded significant portions of the old underground at multiple levels. The 1200-foot level, in the pit's current configuration, sits at or below the standing water line. That water, an acidic copper sulfate solution accumulating since the pumps were shut off in 1980, has been classified by the Environmental Protection Agency as one of the largest active Superfund contamination sites in the United States. The old underground workings are subjects of no current institutional attention. They are drowned, inaccessible, and absent from every operational and environmental document concerning the site. The drift is sealed twice over now, first by the men Plunkett sent down with rolled steel plate and welding equipment in the early hours of October 25, 1895, and again by the rising water of the Berkeley pit, which began filling the work levels the moment the pumps went quiet. Whatever exists beyond that welded plate, if the plate has survived the corrosive chemistry of the pit water, sits under both the closure the Anaconda Company placed in the 19th century and the acidic water the Berkeley pit has provided as a second and effectively permanent one. The question of what Reardon found is one the surviving record poses without resolving. Margaret Reardon's letter describes cut stone, working marks, walls that were not natural rock, and the residue of old fire in a sealed underground space. The company's own supply ledger documents a closure of extraordinary speed and permanence for a drift that had presented no prior structural concerns. The payroll records document the dispersal of the crew within the week and the permanent departure of at least one experienced driller from any subsequent underground employment. The survey maps document the erasure of the drift from the cartographic record. The shift log documents a 16-day gap in a previously unbroken series, with no evidence of removed pages. Arthur Voss's daybook documents a district manager's unscheduled afternoon at a shaft he had no operational reason to visit, and the closure of a level on the same afternoon. None of those documents, taken individually, demands an explanation beyond coincidence and ordinary corporate caution. Placed in sequence and read against one another, they describe an event that the Anaconda Copper Mining Company chose to remove from every record under its control, using methods that were permanent, expensive, and conducted under urgency that did not wait for morning. Patrick Reardon worked as a shift boss at the 1,400-foot level of the Anaconda mine for 5 years after the sealing of the Western Drift. He filed his timber requisitions and his shift cards and his powder consumption reports with the same care he had always brought to the work. He logged nothing about the Western Drift in any document that survives. He died in January of 1901 at the age of 47 in the Butte Miners' Hospital of miners' consumption, the silica lung disease that accumulated in the bodies of men who spent years in the dust of hard rock drilling. His death certificate is a routine document. It records his name, his age, his occupation, and his attending physician. It does not record his final days or his final words. His wife found the pocket notebook 11 years later. His brother Declan, who had written home from Butte about rich ground, is last recorded in the city directory for 1903. The materials requisition for the steel plate is in its archival box in Helena. The superintendent's daybook is in its archival box in Helena. The payroll records for the Western Drift crew are filed and catalogued. The gap in the shift log is there, bound and accessible, exactly as it was left in 1895. The private letter Margaret Reardon wrote in 1912 is held by a collector who has permitted limited examination of the document. The survey map that should show the Western Drift does not exist. The welded plate is somewhere below the standing water of the Berkeley pit. The pocket notebook passed from a widow to a priest who kept it until 1917, and then the rectory burned in 1923. The district manager who ordered the closure died in the San Francisco fire. The superintendent who wrote down his visit retired and left no memoir. The driller who went forward into the void with Reardon on a Wednesday morning in October of 1895 spent the rest of his working years on the surface, and the reason for that is not recorded anywhere that has been found. Voss's 3 lines remain: Plunkett down at 2, 1200 closed. The daybook moves on from there to timber costs and ventilation records, and the ordinary administrative weight of a company that employed 3,000 men. What happened between the 2 o'clock arrival and the notation of a closed level is not in the daybook, and the daybook is the closest surviving document to the decision. Somewhere in the hours between Plunkett's descent and the dispatch of the contract welders from the smelter shop 16 miles away, a man who held enough authority to act on it looked at what Patrick Reardon had found at the face of the Western Drift and decided that the appropriate response was steel plate and a night shift, and a level that would not appear on any map that followed. That decision is the document the company did not write. The speed of it, the permanence of it, the erasure that followed it from the shift log and the survey record, and the payroll files, these are the text of the account that was never put on paper. The record that survives says that something was pulled from the 1,200-foot Western Drift of the Anaconda mine on a Wednesday morning in October of 1895, and that by Thursday it was behind a welded plate in a drift that no longer appeared on the map of what was underground. The record does not say what it was. It says only that whoever gave the order believed that sealing it permanently and sealing it that night was worth more than any copper the Western Drift might still have held. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.